Indonesia and the United States, a treaty executed pursuant to U.S. law, which said that those weapons could not be used for offensive purposes. So if Suharto carried through with his general's recommendation and invaded East Timor, he would be breaking U.S. law. He would be violating the terms under which he had been given 90% of his weaponry. And the CIA and the DIA were cabling back to Washington that Suharto was very nervous about any possibility of U.S. dissatisfaction, about any threat of a cut in U.S. aid. Domestically, within the U.S. at this time, there was indeed some popular and congressional pressure to cut aid to Indonesia because Indonesia was an oil-producing state. The U.S. at that time was suffering the economic shock of the oil price increases. Aid to a country like Indonesia was rather unpopular. So Suharto wanted to be absolutely sure that any move he made on East Timor had the full approval of the United States from the highest levels. Throughout the year, he received signals and statements from Washington that the U.S. had no objection to an invasion of East Timor, but Suharto wanted to get the assurances face to face. And on the morning of December 6th, he got them from Ford and Kissinger. 16 hours later, Indonesian troops were coming ashore at Dili Bay. They swept ashore and went through the streets, dragging people out from their homes. By this time, the government of East Timor had retreated to the mountains with what guns they had left over from the Portuguese administration in hopes of mounting a guerrilla resistance. The population of Dili at this point was overwhelmingly civilian. The Indonesian troops dragged them out to the Aria Branca, the white sand beach, and lined them up along the beach, gunning them down with their American machine guns. They brought them down to the harbor, gathered crowds of people at gunpoint, ordered the crowds to count off one by one as the bodies fell. In this manner, they executed Roger East, the wire service reporter, the wife of the Timorese prime minister, the head of the Timorese Women's League, probably thousands of people in all. They wanted to send the message to the Timorese: Indonesia was here, this was the new rule in East Timor. As this was happening, detailed hour-by-hour reports were coming back to the White House and being relayed on to Ford's plane as he was traveling in Asia. The Australian military has a signal station set up in the northwest of Australia, which enabled them to intercept all Indonesian electronic communications. And they were able to give excruciatingly detailed hour-by-hour accounts on Indonesian military planning and strikes and so forth. What began on that day was one of the great massacres, one of the great genocides of the late 20th century. Kissinger and Ford, particularly Kissinger, had urged the Indonesians to get the invasion over with quickly. They were giving permission to violate U.S. law, but Kissinger was afraid that this could become an issue in the U.S. Congress. There's even a transcript of an internal State Department meeting which shows Kissinger berating his subordinates because some of them had put notes on paper regarding the U.S. policy toward Timor. He didn't want any of this to leak. But the theory was that if the Indonesians could get it over with quickly, use sufficiently massive force, they could have Timor before it became an issue in Congress. As it happened, they did not get it over with quickly. To this day, there is fierce resistance by the East Timorese, although at this point, the Timorese are essentially out of weapons. The Indonesian military estimates they have a couple hundred. I think that may be a credible estimate. What happened was that when the Indonesians came in, they found that those with guns resisted them in the hills, and the others, the people in the villages, picked up and left town. They retreated into the mountains rather than waiting in their villages for the entrance of the Indonesian troops. And a full 2 years after the invasion, Indonesia had still not secured control over a majority of the Timorese population. It was at this point, at the end of the Ford and the beginning of the Carter administration, that the United States shipped in planes and helicopters, particularly OV-10 Bronco planes designed for flying low over the trees, enabling them to machine gun and bomb at low altitudes. They used these planes and helicopters to bomb and strafe people out of the hills. The Timorese were brought down and placed in resettlement camps. At one time, fully one-half of the national population of East Timor was in prisoner resettlement camps. In this camp, the Indonesian army imposed a policy of forced starvation. They restricted people from going out to farm their fields. They were afraid that if they got out into the fields, they would start talking to each other. They would start plotting against the army. They might make contact with those who are still refugees in the hills. They might make contact with the guerrillas in the hills. There are detailed Indonesian military manuals disclosing these procedures, which are now out, have leaked on the public record. Indonesia had sealed off East Timor to the world, but at months into this policy of forced starvation, a few international relief workers were able to get in. One described it as being worse than Biafra. A few photos have come out from that period showing children with limbs like pencils and the large heads and the distended bellies. As this was going on, the U.S. was continuing to pump military aid into Indonesia. Immediately after the invasion, the U.S. had reacted by doubling military aid to Indonesia. Just as today, the State Department is now calling for a doubling of U.S. military training aid in the wake of the November 12 Dili massacre. What Indonesia did in East Timor was, I think, in a sense, rather unusual in the annals of world repression. I've spent quite a few years covering some of the most repressive regimes on earth, places like El Salvador, Guatemala. These places are truly hell on earth. But I have to say that until I went to East Timor, I had never seen a place where the authorities had succeeded in making so many people quite so terrified. The reason is that the army set about a systematic dismantling of Timorese society. There are no unions in East Timor, no press, no student groups, no professional groups. All have been disbanded, their leadership executed, banned by military fiat. To the extent that the Timorese have a civic life, they conduct it underground. As you walk through Dili and start to talk to the people, you soon notice virtually every block contains a military or police base. Many of the houses which appear to be civilian dwellings are actually military torture and interrogation houses. We met with Governor Carrascolau, asked him about this. I asked the governor, do you know where the torture houses are? He said, of course, everybody knows where the torture houses are. I said, well, have you ever tried to go in one? Because he had been telling us up to that point that he was always trying to restrain the military in their repression against the people. He reacted with incredulousness to the question. He said, go into one of the torture houses? Are you kidding? I'm only the governor of East Timor. What if some lieutenant decides to shoot me? I don't have that kind of authority. This is the highest ranking Timorese authority. As we would walk in August of 1990, coming into Dili, people would approach you on the streets, anyone who was obviously a foreigner. They would sidle up very warily, very nervously, whisper something like, they'll kill us if they see us talking. And then very quickly, in very condensed form, they killed my father, they killed my wife, they killed my cousins of the United Nations. Please inform the Prime Minister of Australia. Please tell the Congress of the United States. Time after time, place after place, in villages throughout the country, people would approach in this manner when you had a chance to get alone with someone, especially if you could speak to them in Portuguese. It was like people casting a bottle out onto the ocean with the message that they were trapped on an island with those who had just slaughtered a third of their relatives and friends and asking somehow for some kind of international aid. Many of these people had a sincere hope that if only the President of the United States could hear about this, if only the Congress could hear about what was going on, then they would help. That day on November 12th, the banners those people were carrying as they walked from the motel to the cemetery, many of them were pleas of that sort. They said things like, help us, President Bush, asking for help from Portugal, assuming that the U.S. could play a constructive and humane role. The fact of the matter is, though, that the guns that were trained on them, the M16s, were supplied by the United States. The go-ahead for the original invasion was given by the United States. The planes and helicopters which brought them down from the hills and into the prison camps were supplied by the United States. And on a day-to-day basis, the U.S. is backing this occupation of East Timor, which is illegal. It's a rather simple matter. The UN Security Council has passed 2 resolutions calling on Indonesia to withdraw without delay. These resolutions were not enforced. In his memoirs, Daniel Patrick Moynihan writes, he was the U.S. ambassador to the UN at the time, that he received orders from the State Department to see to it that the UN prove utterly ineffective in any measures it might undertake to enforce these resolutions. He said he carried this task out with no inconsiderable success. After the November 12 massacre, General Trisu Trisno, the highest-ranking officer in the Indonesian military, the overall commander of the Indonesian military, gave a speech to a gathering of military graduates, a formal set-piece speech. He said, referring to those who had gathered outside the cemetery in Dili, he said, "These are despicable people, quote, people who must be crushed." He said, quote, "Delinquents like these agitators have to be shot, and we will shoot them." He added, "Come what may, let no one think they can ignore the Indonesian armed forces. In the end, they will have to be shot down." This was a statement of policy from the highest-ranking Indonesian officer. He repeated words to the same effect twice more, in the end saying, as soon as the army completed its investigation, they will move to annihilate all separatist elements in East Timor that have tainted the dignity of Indonesia. President Suharto himself referred to the massacre as a small thing. He told about on how on his world tour he would meet with world leaders and they would ask him what's going on in East Timor, and he then said he would point to the map. He said, "I showed them a map where East Timor is located, the tiny island called East Timor, that small thing that caused everybody to make a fuss." And he said they all laughed when he pointed out to them what a minuscule place this really was. As Indonesia got some international criticism, because we as foreigners happened to be there and witness and survive this, they responded, first with a report which said it was a group of renegade soldiers, second by transferring some generals out, finally by submitting several officers and soldiers to military discipline. They sent a new commander into East Timor, General Saiafi. He said that his predecessor had been too patient, had been too lenient, and he said that under his new regime in East Timor, they would no longer tolerate such demonstrations. He said that anyone who is an opponent of Indonesia would be hunted down. He said in a recent interview in the March 14th edition of Editor, quote, "If something similar to the 12 November event were to happen under my leadership, the number of victims would probably be higher." This is the new general they brought into East Timor in the ostensible reform, the ostensible constructive response to the massacre. Since the massacre, there have been reports which Amnesty International has characterized as credible of executions of eyewitnesses and survivors of the massacre. Others have been put on trial and are facing the death penalty. The head of the Indonesian Armed Forces has declared this was an act of policy. The new commander says they'll crack down and they'll kill even more next time. And the U.S. has responded by saying it wants to increase the military training aid. Why does it want to increase the aid? Because it will civilize the Indonesian military, as one congressional aide explained to me recently. This point of view, I think, is very unfair to the Indonesians. This idea that the U.S. has something to teach to the Indonesian military that will bring them to a more humanitarian plane of behavior. But if we look fairly and objectively at the record on East Timor, we're not just talking about the behavior of General Sutrisno. We're not just talking about the values of President Suharto. We're also talking about the values of Gerald Ford and Henry Kissinger and Ronald Reagan and George Bush and those who staff the U.S. State Department, who day after day, as this running massacre has continued, have responded with fresh shipments of weaponry and fresh infusions of U.S. cash. For fiscal year 1990, the last year for which figures are available, there were more than $230 million worth of foreign military sales, shipments, government-to-government military aid into Indonesia. For fiscal year 1991, the Pentagon estimates there will be $50 million in foreign military sales agreements. For fiscal year 1991, in addition, the Pentagon estimates there will be $71 million in commercial military sales, which are licensed by the U.S. government. Now, this happens to be